Welcome back. We have an early start and people are still coming, but I think we have to get going because otherwise we're running late. I would like to start today with saying a big thank you for contributing so much yesterday. We know it was a very intense program. We're trying new formats and methods to find new knowledge, and we really appreciate that everyone contributed so generously with their thoughts and time. We also try to be listening in on everything that's been going on, but also what you thought about it, and we do appreciate the feedback as well. One thing that came up is that the discussions were a little bit too short, so we're going to try and adjust a little bit today with the formats. And David's going to also talk you through the format again of the formats. We will start today with a presentation of the research report, Public Art Research, Mapping the Field. It's a presentation by Södertörn University and Valand Academy, Gothenburg University. And we will also run you through today's program at some point. Could just mention that after the report, it will be also an introduction by Gustav Malm from Vinnova and Christina Lavelle from Formas, talking about recent research funding options for this kind of research. And there will be a short Q&A afterwards. And after this first morning sessions, we will start again with elective workshops. Okay. Oscar Svanelid, Håkan Nilsson, Kjell Caminha, and Mick Nilsson. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, this is the brief we had to make a report on the current state of research on public art in the Nordic countries and in the wider international context. And so the four of us put together this report over the summer. It was done in a relatively short period of time. And basically, our ambition was just to provide an overview of the current state of research, and a key purpose in doing this was to begin to identify where needs and opportunities for the development of research programs to support further development of public art and further development of the knowledge base around public art. So, of course, the big problem, how do we define public art for the purposes of doing an initial survey? So we recognise that it's commonly used in a very broad way to designate artistic works that have been conceived specifically for the public realm, but then you have the question, what is the public realm, etc. This includes works that are ephemeral and works that have an enduring nature, so we have this kind of temporary, permanent dichotomy that often appears in the field. And then we also have the fact that we have a wide range of internal temporalities to these works, so works that are realised in an episodic way, works that are durational, embedded, participatory public art projects, and so forth. And then we also have a wide range of spatial qualities to any possible public work, so you have site specificity, things that are specifically made for one location and lose their identity as art if they're moved into another location. We have also the way in which placemaking has become a key theme within a lot of public art programs. And then we also have the kind of really vast question of how digital and virtual technologies transform the construction of the public realm. And in terms of a methodology, we approached a very simple, basically online searches, producing a large sample, and then within that sample we took a shorter sample of works that we thought were particularly important or illustrative of what was going on in the field. We had two strands. We had the Nordic strand and we had the wider international context, and those are two very different corpuses. The relative scale of the kind of wider international context as against the Nordic context. So if you go to the next slide. So we took two slightly different, it's just a nuance of difference in the approach. Maybe Håkan, do you want to say something about how we approach the Nordic context?
Yes, thank you, Mick. Well, we decided on that we should focus on academic resources and research. So what happened then, of course, is that a lot of contributions to these discussions that is not published within the realm of academia or universities are not included in this research survey.
And so we took a similar approach in as much as that we worked primarily with academic sources, particularly focusing on PhD and master's dissertations. However, in addition, for the wider international context, we also targeted some specific contributions that were coming from within the field, thinking of where public art projects are construed or commissioned or initiated as acts of inquiry in their own right. So this appears in both the Nordic context and in the international context. It's just that in the international context, we specifically went looking for those things because of their kind of important impact in the last decade. But again, the difference should not be overstated. It's just a kind of nuance, and it's really to do with the fact that we have this much greater corpus of material internationally, and so doing a random sampling survey was not going to work. We needed also to specifically target things. I'll hand over to Oscar.
So some basic on how we frame the survey and the method that we use to gather the material. Basically 3 steps. We started by using keywords at various research databases in the different Nordic countries. And of course here we get down to the very strict level on how to define public art, because we started with public art in the various translations to the Nordic languages, except Finnish and Icelandic, because we're lacking language skill. But then of course there are other kinds of artistic practices that may be relevant for an expanded notion of public art. And yesterday we discussed where is the end of public art as an expanded notion, and this was what we discovered to be not any clear parameters, but it's a constant construction. And then we also scanned literature lists within these publications to get a notion of the actual field, and also contacted various academic and non-academic sources to help me recommend other contributions which they thought vital to this theme. And of course, with these 3 steps, we still know that we have may have omitted some various important contributions, and we are happy for input. Yes.
Again, as the small disclaimer that we can only find what we're looking for, so to speak. So there might be relevant dissertations that have not used one of these keywords, unless we didn't find it. Good. So when we gathered all this information, or rather when Oscar gathered all this information, we tried to write as a narrative, and we looked then for similarities between various research sources. And then after having doing that, which is the text you have been receiving, is then we so that there are kind of 9 different headings, invisible headings in your text, but they're kind of there. So this is the way we're going to present it to you now, that we see similarities between research, the resources, and then we gather them under these headings. You can go to the next. So, with cultural policies, there's we look at we gather resources that looks to the foundations for commissioning in public art. So it's not so much about what public art does out in the reality, more about how it comes to be. And we didn't find so many dissertations about this, so I was a bit surprised. Actually, only 2 researchers that we have in this strand that are really obviously engaged in this, and one of them is Katja Lindqvist, who is at the Department of Service Management and Service Studies in Lund University. And she's been working many years with like the economics behind public art. And she's also been looking for this notion of governance, which I think is interesting and relevant for us. Where, I mean, there's governance, as you might know, say something about the way the government can, what kind of impact the government still have when it's challenged by both global and regional forces. So it's a kind of basically what impact the Swedish state has over public art when it also has to deal with the regulations from the EU, for example. So that's what she's been looking into.
Yeah, and commissioned art is what perhaps encompasses the more traditional field of public art, public sculpture, monuments, and one general thing you can say about these kind of studies is they usually they do not depart from like value judgments about how public art should be, but rather from empirical investigations, what is already and actually there. And one example is Jessica Sjöholm Skrubbe's dissertation, Skulptur I folkhemmet, sculpture in the people's home, which is over a decade old, but still holds, I think, where she studies public sculpture formed in the rise of the Swedish welfare state during the post-war period. And what she managed to show, which is still interesting, I think, is that we have to be reminded that public art was not a neutral representation, but rather some kind of ideological medium which can be seen to reproduce certain norms and power structures and values, where Sjöholms Skrubbe focuses on gender and social politics, which also opens research question for us now to see as well what kind of factors and values that can be found to govern public art in a Nordic context today.
Sure. It's your plan.
Do you have the social?
Okay. Yeah. So, art and social inclusion. As we can see here from what we're reading, that it's more about focusing on how art can function in terms of sustainability and ecological and social inclusions. And we were looking, for instance, at an article from Siv Bu and Werner Hansen. It's called Home is to be Understood. And it focuses on an exhibition called Art in Exile by a contemporary art museum in Roskilde, which involved artists with a refugee status. And they were trying to then look into this exhibition to uncover institutional and social challenges, but they were also, of course, interested in how and to what extent the collaboration of institutional art projects was successful with this intentional democracy art and making social ethical contributions. So it's kind of problematizing the idea and discussing it.
Yeah, and participatory art, of course, is very, very closely related. And as you can see, art and social inclusion, participation, this is where the main activity in the Nordic field are in the current research. And of course, this is somehow related to changes in the art world, the participatory turn in the 90s and 2000s, as well as to older ideals, perhaps, about art, public art as some kind of democratic vehicle or tool. But today, participation is also problematized as a kind of movement rather than an idea, with many components and actors and relations. And there are Danish researchers such as Christine Samson and Hjördis Brandrup Kortbeck, sorry for my bad Danish, but who has studied how activist art, do-it-yourself urbanism has been integrated and redeployed in the creative city. in ways which constantly renegotiates the limits between public and private, between art and commerce, and so on, which can make us reflect whether these dichotomies still hold between private and public, art and commerce, or perhaps use as an argument for us to invent a stronger notion of the publicness of art.
Yeah, and in a very broad term, artistic research is, which can of course deal with any of these headings that we've already been talking about, but we choose to separate the artistic researchers from the other researchers because, when the art also is not only as an object for discussion, but where the art is actually the investigation, made it into a methodological interesting field to discuss as such. So, there are many more differences between those 14 projects that we've been looking into than there are on the other headings. Having said that, I thought it was interesting to talk about Maria Sparre-Petersson because of a little bit what we talked about yesterday about materiality, because she's at the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts and the School of Architecture, Design and Conservation. And her dissertation, Recycle, about sustainability in glasscraft and design, looks into theories and methods of practices around glasscraft and design and sustainability in relationship to a series of activities, including then a lot of various approaches to this, and from personal experiments to teaching experiments to interventions and in the public sphere. So it's not like a clean case of public sphere art, but we're using the public sphere as kind of one of the areas or arenas for the craft.
And finally, outside the universities, we looked at museums of public art, which function as some kind of research platforms. Kjell, which is the public art museum in Denmark, is perhaps the one with the most advanced research program, I would say, which have organized a variety of seminars, of course, which others has as well, but as well publications and exhibitions, and as well programs for urban development and public artworks, and it has also acquired PhD positions as in a recent project about contemporary art and urbanity, urban space, led by a PhD student called Sabine Dahl, who at the time was also affiliated with the University of Copenhagen. So this could be something that we could discuss or reflect upon whether this would be doable or desirable in the other these kind of collaborations between public art museums and universities in the other Nordic countries.
So if we just turn to the wider international survey, again, research based on academic sources. We're primarily working with Anglophone, but we also checked against some of the Portuguese and French sources. And you can move it on. So roughly looked at just over 200 different sources, 90% of these approximately from conventional academic sources, and then 10% from non-academic, non-traditional. So as an example, say Transparadiso, Austrian-based, Vienna-based architecture collaboration that do architectural commissions, public art commissions, but do these within the broad framework of a research enterprise and their proposition about the new urban practitioner as a kind of solution to many of these questions that are on the wall here. So we take this set of headings, which were largely the kind of brief that we got from the agency to try and see what was happening in relation to these headings, and I'll hand over to Kjell. I can do the slides if you want to.
Yeah, no, it's fine. So the first heading is policy or organization. We were preoccupied or focused on where public art research tried to deal with perspectives on percentage for art schemes, citywide or urban area-based programs and schemes. So what we could find, it was a little bit under 10% of this material. So we would say that it's a kind of undeveloped area of inquiry. So in this material, you could find planning programs for public art in university campuses, so research on that, policies in production via art biennials and institutional off-site programs, research on genealogy of festivals, and so on and so forth, private ownership of public art, percent art programs, beneficiaries and its justifications, and some public art policy development for communities, which is quite tied into this public art in planning and urban as well. So one thing that we could point is like the question of alternative forms of collective or community commissioning. So the commissioning bodies giving up or asking more or giving agency to the community or the place in question was quite underrepresented, I would say. And it was also less research with longitudinal studies of possible impact of percent barge in regional and national context. And also the relationship between organization cultures of commission agencies and natures of public art program outcomes. It's something that it was less researched. The next heading, public art and architecture. Surprisingly, using these keywords that I use, commissioning, public art, both in Portuguese, Spanish as well, French, English, there was not so much related, from my findings with public art and architecture. But there is, I'm aware that there's a lot of articles and anthologies about public art and architecture. So that's one thing that using those keywords, we didn't cover that much. But within this section, one could find research and integration of art and architecture, sustainability, questions of sustainability, research on case studies on the value interactions between an artwork, the participants of this artwork, or the people living around this artwork and the built environment. A lot on the relationship between landscape architecture and public art, the value of public art and landscape architecture, and also we forgot to put studies on how can one design tools for public space to somehow accommodate public art. Another heading was public art and planning in urban and rural environment, and this was the kind of a second largest availability of research, so more or less 20%. So the themes include public art in urban and rural regeneration, commissioning policies and planning, public art in relation to how can one create and develop sustainable communities and urban environments, redevelopment of suburbs, that was quite common inquiry, public art and well-being, and the question about public art commissioning to somehow tackle segregation. The largest area of research that I could find was public art and social involvement, or public art and participation. So we could find also theoretical strands of research in terms of what could publicness means and how one could define it in relation to different participation-based artworks, public artworks. Art and pedagogy. So how can public art is embedded or has been embedded in pedagogy, public pedagogy practice within participatory approaches. Research on community and conflict, institutions or commissioning perspectives that sustain conflict as one of the main substantial, support to actually develop projects like that, and public art and social change. Yes, and of course this relationship about participation in public art, but in relation to the artist's role in terms of how the participant bodies are instrumentalized or not. And another category that it wasn't the briefing, but we thought to include this kind of a misfit category, includes all kind of artistic expressions, and so you find the counter monument, commemoration, a lot of graffiti or unsanctioned art perspectives or modes of alternative public art intervention. Like I said before, questions on the artist's role, the public art 2.0, so virtual public art, and also a lot in terms of how curating is being developed in relation to public art. And we jump into the conclusions, I guess.
Yes. Well, one as Kjell also mentioned, that there's the question of participatory art projects of various sorts is kind of a central theme in what we have found, and that we find less about the politics behind commissioning public art, and that we also find that many of these researchers who are looking at participatory art projects have a critical voice towards the problem of instrumentalization of those tactics.
But also still believes very much in the potential of public art as some kind of democratic tool.
Mm-hmm.
There's a very strong, still utopian, productive, and actual results showing that public art can be used to stimulate democratical, some kind of dialogue or democratic arenas, work for inclusions, and so on, yeah.
Yes, I mean, on what same note as Oscar was saying, that there's another undertext in this research, that the public sphere as such is under threat, and that public art is one of the things that might keep the public space public.
Okay, one of the things that we had suspected at the beginning was that case study is the most common research instrument in evidence, so that kind of characterizes the research field entirely, is the predominance of case study. Another is a tendency, now this is by no means absolute, but there is this very strong tendency in the research to privilege the perspective of the producers. In terms of organisation for Centre for Art, there's clearly a need for further research, and we would say, this is a proposition, that the challenge is to develop shared frameworks for national and international comparative studies. And we would flag there maybe locating the producers, Claire Doherty, Paul O'Neill, a set of comparative case studies. And we think that maybe that type of approach needs to be developed further. In terms of art and architecture, there's clearly an opportunity to empirically map and catalogue the different ways in which art and architectural commissions have been implemented. So we think that there's kind of just basic descriptive empirical research that could be done to just create a mapping of how these kinds of commissions are constructed. In terms of public art and urban and rural development contexts, there's clearly a need for some meta-level analyses, that actually there's so much material out there, but we need some synthesis. So there's a need for people to maybe produce some kind of larger synthesis of the quite voluminous amount of material that's there. In terms of the research evidence is a significant role for non-official culture, illicit culture, self-commissioned, etc. Suggests that an important avenue for future research will be to explore the relationships or tensions between official and unofficial culture, and with that, the potential for the role of public art practices that are conceived as research interventions in their own right. We think the articulation between academic research institutions, museums, and practices in the field in shared research projects is actually an important avenue for development. More work in terms of possible strategies for working with publics to investigate the experience in the public realm. So instead of the producer side perspective, these other perspectives. And then in terms of research in public art, we think that there's a problem that we need to take seriously, which is that if we are considering the question of in what sense is public art public, we need to consider in what sense is the knowledge that we're trying to build around public art also caught with this problem of its public. How does this knowledge operate as a public good, or what is its stake in publicness? And then I'll hand over to Håkan just for some general conclusions. I think this is the one thing we converged on at the end, that we were unanimous on this point.
Yeah, but I mean, it's also a question of because when we were looking for similarities, and obviously that can be a problem, and we should of course look for a heterogeneity also in research. And so there's no way of saying that there is a field that is about public art. There's so many fields, but they overlap, and then there's where we can find.
And just final, and Nordic researchers must start talking to each other and reading each other's work, because this is another tendency.
And if I could just take this very last proposition, because it was being discussed yesterday in one of the workshops about the possibility of constructing national data sets. And rather than that being a policing operation, it could just be a basis on which to establish an empirical unfolding of the field instead of defining the field through some abstract concept. And we basically took the cue here from ICSIA, a think tank on public art that was set up in the UK by Arts Council of England funding. And ICSIA, for a period of several years, produced these annual descriptive surveys of just the number of commissions, the volume, the location by region, and so forth. And it was an incredibly useful, simple mapping of what is actually the field of activity. And we think that this, conceived either on a Swedish or Nordic or other basis, might be a useful research tool for a whole range of different researchers. We also think that given the way in which public records are kept here, that actually it might be quite relatively simple undertaking to try and begin to produce these kinds of national data sets. But of course, we know that there needs to be some serious discussion about how the data sets will be constructed and what kind of interests are represented in that. But we still think that it would be interesting even just to discuss the viability of national data sets.
No, it's really interesting, and thank you so much for this report. Do you have any immediate questions from the floor? I think we're lucky to have the rest of the day bringing this presentation with us. As Oscar was saying, that we need to discuss more amongst ourselves and amongst the different countries. And of course we have the draft that was sent out, and as you mentioned in the beginning, we're very happy to have feedback on that, and we have all our contacts, and we will bring it in and try to work on it to conclude the report. Yeah.
And maybe just to say, because we are under a little bit of time pressure to finish the final version of the report, and we are looking at something that will be edited and shortened and polished, but it would be really great if we had some feedback and input and suggestions. We're hoping to have the thing concluded by the end of the month. So if you are going to give us some feedback, it would be great if you could do so within the next 10 days or so. We know it's a little bit of pressure, but it would really, really help us to improve the quality of what's in there and make it more useful.
Thank you. Yeah, and we were thinking also with the experience from yesterday, and also with this in mind, that we could focus the open space session later this afternoon more on actual research questions. But you can also add, of course, to that agenda. So we could bring it in already for today, if you want to. Okay, thank you very much. Then I would like to